So thanks for that introduction, and thank you also to Pluriel for convening, for the intellectual work of convening this marvelous event, Trends Research, for bringing us all together here today to discuss these important topics. In the research center, in a think tank, which is fundamentally what we are, we spend a lot of time looking at external trends. And in the context of geopolitics, global geopolitics, geopolitics in the Middle East, the intersection with the interfaith dialogue, those trends are not the most reassuring. Cultural hatred and religious division, as we all know here, are expected to be drivers of conflict in the 21st century. At the national levels, we're seeing pronounced divisions, again, on religious and cultural lines, not only the beginnings of this in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, in the East, in Asia, and in other areas. On a global politics level, the situation is in flux, and there are some major trends developing in the sense that, again, something that we all know, the shift from a unipolar, hegemonic world to a multipolar, more fragmented world made up of regional blocs and regional alliances and so on. The scenario is, of course, based on a trend. When we don't have facts, we look at trends to analyze. But we've also, over the course of the 20th century, evolved certain solutions to deal with conflicts with instability. There are 3 or 4 of those. The first is political trust. And again, today we see possibly an all-time low. There are international indices which measure this, and we don't need to spend too much time discussing that. Political trust is at an all-time low. Economic relations, the international economic institutions are also having something of a struggle, in the sense that the multilateral support for those institutions is beginning to decline, and free trade is no longer as free as it was even 10 or 15 years ago. The third so-called solution, multilateralism under the auspices of the UN. Similarly, my personal sentiment is that it isn't as relevant, as strong as it used to be, even a relatively short time ago. And finally, diplomacy, and this is an interesting one. Diplomacy used to be purely diplomacy, whereas today we have the emergence of a more sanctions-based diplomacy, which is, of course, more coercive in nature. So there's a decline in effectiveness in terms of diplomacy, in my view, as well. Now, of course, there are pockets of success with regards to these solutions across the world, but it's difficult to characterize their effectiveness as being a global effectiveness. What this means in practice, in the context of geopolitics, is that there's a tendency for state actors to revert to a more zero-sum formulation, framing of problems, and in some cases subsequent activity, in the sense that I gain and you lose, or you win and I lose. So this happens at the extreme, the extremes of instability and uncertainty and volatility. Coming to the Middle East, surprisingly, as we all know over the past few years, the news has been positive, in the sense that the Abraham Accords in 2020, representing an incredible and decisive policy shift, to normalize relations between Israel and Arab states and among the grouping, abruptly changed the status quo in the region. And it provided some momentum in geopolitical terms to other initiatives which were interesting at the time. In 2023, they had started to discuss normalization between Saudi Arabia and some of the other regional states. And that has been more or less interrupted or suspended, we hope temporarily, by the events which took place in Gaza around the beginning of October. So uncertainty has also returned to the region after a few years in which we thought that the period of stability would last longer. Now, to characterize interfaith dialogue in relation to geopolitics, prima facie, we see that there is a tremendous dissimilarity, because, of course, the geopolitical calculation is one of hard power. And you mentioned this, Professor. You know, how strong is your army, and how much global political influence do you wield? So there's a difference between large states and small states, and also what resources do you have at your disposal? And so again, we're talking about money, we're talking about increasingly technology, energy, oil. So these are the normal, the geopolitical calculus takes place, but it doesn't account for dialogue as much. Dialogue is perceived to be the job of diplomacy from a geopolitical lens. The stakeholders involved in geopolitical activity are very few, from the presidential, prime ministerial level, probably a few generals thrown in, maybe some other advisory personnel. But the stakeholders are nothing like the rich ecosystem of stakeholders involved in interfaith dialogue, which go from religious leadership to civil organizations to academic experts and scholars to involvement of the media, in some cases of education and so on. So a very stark comparison in terms of the stakeholders. The other differences, you know them, universality versus national interest focused and so on. But there also is a similarity in terms of the objectives of geopolitics and interfaith dialogue in some regards. And I'll explain myself. Today we begin to talk about geopolitics when it's associated with threats, geopolitical risk or advantage or things like that. So again, at an extreme. But the original geopolitics, Kissinger was an exponent of this, was strategic balance. And so the objective of strategic balance and the various doctrines was, of course, deterrence, but also peace and stability. So in that regard, the pure concept of geopolitics, so let's say one school of geopolitics, has changed a little bit, but the outcomes, from my perspective, are very similar. The difference is that the balance in geopolitics is about power, and the balance in interfaith dialogue is about trust. It's a very profound difference. Coming to the geopolitical contribution of the Abraham Accords, we've discussed the policy shift, how decisive it was, and it achieved its immediate objectives in three ways, really. One is the symbolism of a number of Arab states and Israel formalizing, declaring, and writing down, we value peace ahead of conflict. I've lived in the region for a very long time, and it was a great surprise. It took a while to get used to it. The second thing is normative. Again, the declaration, the formalization of declaring Abrahamic values among three religions are a source of commonality and reciprocal understanding and knowledge. And the third vector is really the practical cooperation aspect, which has given rise to some quite robust flows of trade and investment, travel, exchanges in the scientific and academic worlds, youth-related dynamics, and so on. So this is reminiscent of post-World War II normalization between France and Germany in the late 40s and early 50s. The intent is cultural collaboration, mutual understanding. Today it's unthinkable for there to be a conflict in Europe, of course. I mean, there's a long story after that period of normalization, but that's how it started. On the cultural level, particularly with the exchange of youth, there were dedicated offices and structures set up to encourage that particular mutual knowledge and development of mutual trust. To characterize visually the relation between geopolitics and interfaith relations, it's useful to imagine a process. At the beginning of the process, it's initiated, the Abraham Accords, for example, was initiated by geopolitical actors. It can only be states. So the state initiated the process, and they were behind-the-scenes negotiations, I assume, for a year or two before. And at the end, the outcome is also politics. Who wouldn't like it? It's normalization, stability, in a true geopolitical sense, because the geography of the Middle East. So the outcome is geopolitical, and the beginning of the process. But in the middle, it's day-to-day normalization, which I see as having very much to do with interfaith dialogue, mutual understanding, tolerance, and somehow subsuming those concerns of instability within our daily lives, of trading, of traveling, of knowing youth from the other country, and so on and on. So that, in the middle of the process, I see that that is where the dialogue comes in. How am I doing for time? Three more minutes. I'll try to wrap up quickly. Coming to the UAE's stake in this, its input, and its tradition of tolerance. We hear that this country is important, and it is indeed very important for the success and the implementation of the Accords. It was one of the leading countries, the leading actor at the beginning of the process. It's also a much older tradition, and I'm talking about tolerance specifically here. It's also much older. I'll return to that in a second. The way that we see tolerance is that it's a fail-safe towards the escalation of those tensions on a social level and on a political level that can result in conflict and instability. So this is its true function in an instrumental sense, to ensure that discontent in societies, that hatred never rises to a level where it can cause instability. It's a very important thing. And we're reminded also of southern Spain. I believe you're from Spain, and so Andalusia, or Al-Andalus as it used to be known, between the 8th and the 15th centuries approximately, which saw a wonderful inflorescence of mutual tolerance among the three Abrahamic faiths, and is remembered until today as the golden age of Islam in Europe. So the history of the UAE isn't of course as rich as that, but many of you may know, you may not know, there was an Nestorian monastery of one of the islands called Sirbaniyas. It's less than 200 kilometers from Abu Dhabi. If you had more time, it would be great for you to see it. It's a beautiful island in its own right, and the ruins of this Nestorian monastery. A very long time ago, 7th or 8th century, in any case in the medieval period. The tradition continued, well, for a very long time, until then, but in pre-1971 UAE, so before statehood, churches were established in Abu Dhabi on the Corniche in 1965, and another one in Dubai, in Bur Dubai, in 1967, Church of the Assumption. So the policy of tolerance isn't a state policy, it's a tradition. It was always there in the UAE. I think it's an important fact to acknowledge. Recent history, we're well aware of it, the Ministry of Tolerance and Coexistence, founded in 2016. You had the pleasure of listening to the minister yesterday, His Highness Al Nahyan, and he renamed his ministry now Tolerance and Coexistence. The recent history, 2019, the Declaration on Human Fraternity, Expo 2020, COP 28, both convened in the spirit of inclusiveness, Abrahamic House last year, and museums, and so on, which is part of a story to embed a process. It's a process to embed the norm of tolerance. And it's quite easy to say, well, you built a museum and this Abrahamic house, but I think that the real indication of commitment of the UAE to tolerance is when we look to the future. So you may know that the curriculum, the K-12 curriculum, has been substantially revised over the past 5 or 6 years to include interfaith relations, to include tolerance towards Judaism, towards Christianity, in a very clear and direct way. It's taught in Islamic education. So in Islamic education, the hadiths which speak to tolerance are identified, they're discussed. The signing of the declaration in 2019 is memorialized. I'll finish soon. And so that, to me, is a very clear and very empirical indication that the UAE is looking to the future to raise generations which embody tolerance in their daily lives and behavior. To conclude the main 2 or 3 points, I think that there is a great clarity over the two trends which I mentioned at the beginning, the increase in instability globally, and also arguably a decline in the solutions which we've used so far, multilateralism, sanctions, political trust, so on, to solve problems. And when we consider that in the arc of time, these solutions have been around 70, 80 to 100 years old, naturally over time they become something different to what they were when they were conceived. Right? This is the fundamental issue with these very complex multilateral solutions. Whereas the Abraham Accords and interfaith dialogue, I believe, is in an ascendancy. It's something new. Several speakers, including the keynote today, spoke of the newness of what we're trying to accomplish. The second observation is that the Accords, the Abraham Accords, and we hope to see others and more diverse ones, reflect a geopolitical design and outcome, but normalization is accomplished through dialogue, daily coexistence, and tolerance. And the third and final observation is that tolerance must be more than a policy. It must be a tradition and a culture. With that, I thank you very much for your time and for your attention, and I look forward to hearing my other participants. Thank you.